So in this session I want to talk about two things. I'm going to start with looking at loops, and then in the second half we'll be looking at indexed arrays. But this first set of videos are all about using loops in PHP. So let's start with a recap of the structure, the actual flow that occurs in most PHP programs. So we discussed this in the previous sessions. When we have lots of PHP blocks, what happens is the HTML and the PHP are processed from top to bottom. So the PHP processor basically just works its way through, and every PHP block is processed right way down until we get to the bottom of the page. And once all the PHP blocks have been processed and the HTML code has been generated, the HTML is then sent off to the browser window. Now that's called the flow of the program, and if you don't have any special control structures in the PHP program, then it just the process flow goes from top to bottom of the code. As we saw, sometimes you can change that flow. You might have choices, so there might be possible outcomes that occur in some way, and the way that we do that is to have a condition, and that's done with an if statement or a switch statement. And of course you can make those flows very complex, and we talked about if statements and we talked about switch statements before. So that encapsulates the notion of we have a flow, we have a choice, and various different things will occur depending upon the condition, the choice that occurs at that point. But sometimes we want to do things many times. Now what that actually translates into is this term looping. We want to loop, we want to iterate round and round and round. We want to repeat something many, many times. It could be 5 times, 1,000 times, 1,000,000 times. This notion that some process, some aspect of the program needs to be done again and again and again. And we do that using a loop. Now there are standard loop types in almost all programming languages, and many of them use these reserved words for those kind of loops. Today I'm going to talk about the for loop. Now the way that the for loop works is that you basically suggest how many times the loop will work in advance. So you'll say, I want this to run 4 times or 1,000 times. You could actually say it will run sort of n times or m times. I mean, you may not actually know how many times the loop will run when you're writing the program, but by the time the PHP processor gets to that bit of code, it will know the value of n or m, and it would know, oh, this loop is going to run 20 times or 1,000 times or whatever. So that's what I mean by in advance. We clearly know that there will be a start and an end point to this loop and how many times the loop will actually run. And for loops are really commonly used with arrays, and we'll talk about that later on. But it is worthwhile thinking that basically if you have some data that's held in an array, well, I know we haven't done arrays yet, but we'll do later on, often you'll see arrays and for loops paired together because of the way that arrays work in most languages. So let's have a look at the actual syntax for the language. So there's a reserved word for, and you can see that we have something in brackets, and then we have a statement that comes after that. So what we're actually doing here is we're indicating that the statement, in other words, the thing on the second line, that will occur many times. How many times it will occur? Well, that's described by what goes inside the brackets on the first line. It could be a scenario where we have multiple statements that we need to occur over and over again. So if you look at the second half, the bottom half of the slide, you can see that we use braces in very similar style to the way that we use braces in an if statement. We've got a block of code, and here I've got 4 statements. And what we want is all 4 statements to be repeated over and over again. So let's have a look at that first line in a little bit more detail, where it says start, condition, and change amount. So when we use a for loop, when we use a for statement, there will be 3 things inside the brackets, and those 3 things work together to determine how many times the loop will work. And you'll see this kind of notation when I'm about to show you in PHP. It looks almost exactly the same as in C and JavaScript and Java. It's a very common way of describing how many times something should work in a for statement. So let's just work our way along there. So the first one says start, and what start does is it in here we will describe a kind of counter or a value, and what that value will do is it will keep track of how many times the loop has actually worked. So here we'll initiate a counter and we'll give it an initial value, and often we'll use something like this. We'll go I equals 0. So I is a variable that I've just made up. I is going to be a counter. We're going to give it an initial value. In this instance, we're going to give it an initial value of 0. And what will happen is, as we progress through the loop, I will be the variable that keeps track of how many times the loop has actually run. So you can see it starts off and it's got a value of 0. Now I'm using I here, but of course you can use any kind of sensible name, and there are better sensible names out there like counter or my count or loop or times round the loop or whatever it is that you want to use. But I'm using $i because if you look at code in books, frequently they'll use a very simple variable like this. They might use I or J or K or something like that to sort of indicate that it's a kind of a throwaway value. It's just being used to count the loop. We're not actually bothered about the name that much. Now the second thing is the condition, and this condition is very similar to conditions when we looked at them in if statements. This will be evaluated to see if it's true or false. If this is true, what will happen is that the loop will continue. The moment that the condition hits false, the loop will stop, and any code or HTML that comes after this point would then be processed. So in other words, we would jump out of the loop and then we would our program would continue after the loop point in the code. So just to say that again, this will be evaluated every time we go around the loop, and every time it will be evaluated to see if it's true or false. And if it's true, what will happen is the loop will continue. The moment that that condition returns false, we drop out of the loop. So let's write down an example condition. So these conditions are in the same style as the ones that we saw with an if statement. You know, you can use less than or greater than, less than or equal to, greater than or equal to, etc. In this instance, you can see I'm going to be testing the counter. So we almost always test the counter, and we're going to say while I is less than 20, continue the loop. So what will happen is the value of I will be continually evaluated against 20. So you can see I starts from 0, it will go around, we count, keep going, until eventually there comes a point where this loop, where I is a value greater than 20, and that's returns false, and we drop out of the loop. Now the third thing that we have to do is add a change amount, and this is the bit where we actually change the counter value. So far, if you look inside the brackets, we've created a counter and we've given it an initial value. In the second part, so this is between the semicolons, we've added our test condition. So this loop will continue until I becomes greater than 20. But what we haven't described is how I will change every time the loop runs. So here, what we'll do is we'll add some syntax and language to basically change the counter value. And again, this is a notation that's used in many different programming languages, and it looks like this, $i++. Now that's a shorthand notation for add 1 to I. Now there's something very special going on here about the fact that I placed the plus after the I rather than before the I, but I don't want to talk about that today. You can use this notation, just stick to this notation. And if you look at examples in the books, any introductory book that's talking about loops, they almost always have something that looks like this. So we'll have an initial value for I, and that's going to be the counter. For example, here we've given it a value of 0, which is very common. We're going to progress around the loop 20 times, and the moment that I becomes greater than 20, we will drop out of the loop. Every time we go around the loop, we will do that I++ bit, and what I++ will do is it will add 1 to I, and often that's called incrementing I. So I will start with the value 0, and then we'll go 1, 2, 3, 4, etc. Every time we go around the loop, I will have a value added to it. And the value that we will add will be 1. So let's have a look at that in some actual code. So here you can see I've got a loop, and what this loop will do is it will go around the loop over and over again, counting, and every time we go around the loop, if you look at the 4th line, you can see what it's going to do is it's actually going to print a value out, and it's going to say I'm going around the loop over and over again. One little tip here, and it's very important to do this, the $I loop counter, obviously we can use that inside the loop to do calculations or to do printouts, things like that. Don't start changing the value of the loop counter unless you really know what you're doing, because you could end up creating a loop which never finishes. So you just got to be careful there. So what we'll do next is we'll look at some lots and lots of examples of how loops work.